Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Professor Boucher, and today we're going to be going over process costing. By the end of this video, you're going to understand what process costing is, what makes it different than job order costing, and most importantly, we'll do a practice problem, see how we solve it. So come along with me and let's figure out how to do this. Let's start with the basics. Process costing is used by businesses that make identical or substantially similar products. Think of a manufacturer of something like oil or paint, where it doesn't really make sense to try and track each unit individually. So essentially, what we do is we average the cost over all units produced. If we think back to job order costing, what makes it different is we're using an average of each unit actually being produced. When in job order, you are making a large product that you could track all costs to it specifically. Think of something like maybe a boat or a car. Before we do an example, we need to know some key terms. The first being started and completed. Started and completed is going to be the products or the equivalent products that were actually started this period and fully completed this period. This is going to be a key in determining our total equivalent units. Started and completed can be calculated one of two ways. It's both going to get us to the same point, but we have to determine what information we have to calculate it. The first way that we calculate it is by using our units completed minus our beginning inventory. The second way that we can calculate it is our units started minus our ending inventory. So we'll figure out both ways when we're working on these problems. Because this is a continuous process, our products will be in various stages of completion. So for us to be able to average the costs, we have to come up with a way to identify them. And the way that we do that is coming up with equivalent units. It's essentially, if we aggregated all those pieces together, how many whole units would we have completed? Cost per equivalent unit is the next thing we're going to take a look at. Now that we've identified approximately how many average units we have to take the costs that we've accumulated and distribute them across the average units that we have produced. An important note on how we're doing these problems. We're assuming that 100% of the direct materials are added at the beginning of the period. This makes this process a little bit easier for us. If you stick with accounting, you'll learn some of the more complicated ways to do this when you move on to cost accounting. Let's go ahead and start a practice one. The first thing we're going to work on is trying to find some missing information. Whenever we work on these problems, we're going to have to be given 3 pieces of information. From there, we can always find the 4th, and then ultimately we're using this to find our started and completed number. Before we get started, try and visualize this process. We're working inside of a manufacturing facility. Now, we have units already on our production line, and they're in various stages of completion. Because they're already on our production line, they have to be completed before our next ones can be started. And as that process goes, those would have to be completed before our ones that get left in our ending work in process. Now, let's use some numbers and see how that works, because this shows us how these units would progress through a manufacturing facility. We have 10,000 units in our beginning work in process. So when we turn the lights on, 10,000 units were already on our production line. Throughout this month, the units started were 80,000 units. So at some point during this period, we put an additional 80,000 units into production. And lastly, the units completed during the period were 76,000. This represents the units that we took off of our production line. So when we think about that as a mathematical equation, we would start with the units already on the production line. We would add to that the units that we began this month, and we would subtract from it the units we took off the production line. This would give us our ending work in process of 14,000 units. Now I'm going to use this same information to calculate our units started and completed. For this one, I'm going to use units completed minus beginning inventory. So in our case, we had units completed of 76,000 minus our beginning inventory of 10,000 units. So we had started and completed units of 66,000. Now, as we move through these, we're going to see that basically what we're doing is some simple algebra. The problems may sound more complicated, but we're just moving some things around. If you ever get lost, always remember to go back to our first process up here, where we take our beginning work in process plus units started minus units completed to get our ending work in process. For this next problem, I'm going to write out the basic algebra just so that we can start to visualize how this would work. So in this problem, we would have 500 units plus our 102,500 units that were started minus, in this case, it's unknown, which would ultimately equal our 900 units. So if we were isolating for x, the easiest way to solve this problem would be to do the 500 plus the 102,500, isolate x to the right-hand side by adding x, and subtract 900. I have my 500 plus my 102,500. I'm isolating this for x, so in essence, I'm going to add x to both sides and subtract 900 from both sides. And that's going to give me 102,100 units. Now we're going to use this same information to come up with the started and completed. I'm going to change it up on this one. So instead of using completed minus beginning inventory, I'm going to use the started minus ending inventory. In our case, our units started were 102,000 minus our ending inventory of 900. We end up with started and completed of 101,600 units. Moving on to the next one. Again, I'm just going to kind of draw out the algebra down below. So we've got 1,800 units beginning, plus we don't know how many units were started, minus 90,000 units that were transferred out, equals 200 units still in production. Again, we are going to isolate for x, so I'm going to add 90,000 to each side, and I will subtract 1,800 from each side. In which case, we will get 200 plus the 90,000 minus the 1,800. And we get 88,400 units. Next, again, we'll figure out started and completed. I'm going to go back to the other method just so we can see them both. And we're going to do completed minus beginning inventory. So in this case, we have our completed units, the 90,000 units, minus our beginning work in process, the 1,800, and we come up with 88,200 units that were started and completed this month. Now we're going to work on our final problem. Again, this should feel like old hat to you guys now. I'm going to write out the algebra one more time. So I don't know my beginning work in process. We're going to recognize that with an x, plus our 567,000 units that were started this month, minus our 650,000 units that were completed, equals our ending work in process of 20,000 units. This is going to start with our 20,000 units, plus our 650,000 units, minus our 567,000 units. We would end up with 103,000 units were in our beginning work in process. To come up with our started and completed for these, I'm now going to go back to the units started minus ending inventory. In this case, our units started were the 567,000 minus our ending work in process of 20,000 units. We end up with 547,000 units that were started and completed. This practice was used to find started and completed, which is the linchpin for the rest of the process. Now that we understand that, let's get into a little bit more complicated process. Now we're going to get into the full process costing problem. Before I get into the worksheet, I need to go ahead and give credit to James Howes, professor at Indian River State College, for developing this worksheet. It really helps new students understand how process costing works. So let's take a look at the worksheet. I'm going to start this problem by finding the missing component. The best way to do this, we go back to see what we just did, and we're going to start a chart that looks pretty similar. So we're going to start with our work in process beginning, which is 3,400 units. Then we include our units starting during the period. This told us we started 64,000 units. Now I don't have my units completed during the period, but it did provide me with my ending work in process, or 3,900 units. Just like I did in the other problems, I'm going to show the algebra on the bottom. So we have our beginning work in process of 3,400 units. We added to those 64,000 units that were started. We don't know the units that were transferred out, But we do know that our ending work in process is 3,900 units. Using this information, we're going to isolate for x. So I'm going to add x to both sides, and I'm going to subtract 3,900 from each side. So we're going to start with our beginning work in process plus our units started, ultimately minus our work in process ending. That gives us 63,500 units that were completed during this period. At the very beginning of this video, we talked about equivalent units, and I talked about how units are in various stages of production. That's going to come into play in this problem. So the first part, we see that the work in process was 75% completed. Now, I'm going to refer back to a statement I made in the very beginning, which 100% of direct materials are added at the beginning of the period. So for us, this 75% represents only conversion. And conversion consists of two things. That's going to be our factory overhead and our direct labor. In this problem, 75% of the conversion has been completed already. I can leave these blank, which is why they're highlighted right now. And lastly, my ending work in process, they had 10% of their conversion completed by the end of the period. It's good to put it in the chart now. We're going to use it when we get down to actually figuring out our equivalent units towards the bottom. The next thing that we're going to include is the costs to account for. The whole reason why we do this is we ultimately want to get down to our cost per equivalent unit. So I need to start to figure out my total costs. Now, the first thing we're going to include is our beginning work in process, which it tells us is $23,000. Next, we have materials added, which were $366,080. And finally, we are going to add our conversion, which is $184,020. I'm going to use the power of Excel to go ahead and find that number, and we come up with total costs added for the period of $573,100. This chart looks pretty plain right now, but I'm going to start adding some colors to it, mostly for myself. So whole units. I'm going to highlight this and I'm going to make it yellow. The reason being is I want to make sure I differentiate for myself where are my whole units. The whole units are being pulled from the top part of the problem. So my beginning work in process is the 3,400 units. Now this one, we see it's asking us for our started and completed. So I have to remember I need to use one of those two methods we talked about earlier. I'm choosing to use the units started minus ending inventory. So in my case, the units started were the 64,000 minus my ending inventory, which is the 3,900. That gives us started and completed units of 60,100. Lastly, we have our ending work in process in whole units, and that's just the 3,900 units. Again, we're going to total these up, and we're going to come up with 67,400 total units. Now, the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to highlight this whole section in blue, because this whole section is going to refer back to our direct materials. Again, what we've talked about in here is that 100% of our direct materials are added at the beginning of the period. So items that were already on our production line had their direct materials added last month. So this month I am adding no direct materials. These other two had 100% of their direct materials added during the month. So for both of them, the direct materials added are 100%. To come up with my direct material equivalent units is a pretty simple process. I take my whole units in yellow. I'm going to multiply that by my direct material percentage added during the month, which for beginning work in process is nothing. So we end up with nothing. We're going to use the same process for started and completed and ending work in process. So the math isn't too hard on here. We'll take our whole units multiplied by our percentage added, and we get 60,100. One more time for our ending work in process multiplied by our materials added, 3,900. Lastly, we're going to come together and add everything up for our direct material equivalent units. So these are the average amount of units that we completed during this period. This is a very important number. That's our equivalent unit for direct material. Once we have this number, it's a pretty simple process to come up with our cost per equivalent unit. In essence, we will take our materials added during the period and divide it by our equivalent units. Since we're working on direct materials, our direct materials for the period costs were $366,080. And I have 64,000 direct material equivalent units. That's going to give me $5.72 for a cost per equivalent unit of direct material. Now we're going to move on to conversion equivalent units. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight this in, let's say, a green. Again, this is just so that I can visually separate which parts are for conversion and which parts are for direct materials. Now I'm going to start with the percentages. For materials, it was pretty easy for these problems. On conversion, it's not too bad, but we do have to think about it a little bit. My units that were already started last month, this chart is telling me the conversion was 75% complete when we stopped production last month. I have to complete the rest of them this month, which means I have to complete an additional 25%. Now, if a unit was started and completed this month, we put it on our production line and it's all done before the end of the period. That means that all of my conversion is 100% complete by the end of the period. And lastly, our ending work in process. So these had not been started last month. We began work on them this month and didn't get them fully completed. So this tells us how much we actually got completed for conversion this month. And in our case, it's 10%. We highlighted the whole units in yellow so that we can separate those from our equivalent units. Now I'm going to use those yellow whole units again to calculate my conversion equivalent units. It's a very similar process to our direct material equivalent units, where we are going to start with our whole unit, and then we will multiply it by our conversion added during the month. In our case, it's 25% for our beginning work in process. That gives me 850 units for conversion. Now we've got our started and completed. This one, the math is not too hard. We've got 60,100 whole units multiplied by 100% conversion added, so that number doesn't change. Lastly, we're going to go ahead and take our ending work in process, and we were only able to add 10% conversion this month, so we're going to have 390 conversion equivalent units for ending work in process. Just like we did for direct material, I need to come up with my total equivalent units for conversion. And in our case, we are going to come up with 61,340 equivalent units for conversion. Those equivalent units represent the average units of conversion completed this month. So we're going to go ahead and get that cost per equivalent unit of conversion. Same process as before. We're going to take the total costs for conversion, $184,020, divided by our 61,340 units. That gives me a cost per equivalent unit of $3 for conversion. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to change the color of my cost assignments. Now, I just like to keep everything visually separated. It makes it a little bit easier to understand what we're doing. The first cost that we're going to assign is beginning inventory. Now, there's only one thing that was in beginning inventory. That's our beginning work in process of $23,000. And talking about it again, this beginning inventory of $23,000 represents two things. It represents 100% of the direct materials for these units. It also represents, in this case, 75% of the conversion that was added last month. So we've got $23,000. Now for the rest of them, they were not part of our beginning inventory. So the only thing that we are going to have here is our $23,000. Next, we're going to calculate our direct materials. Based on what we just talked about, you can probably assume that there's no direct materials added this month. And you'd be correct, but I'm still going to follow the sheet. So for direct materials, we are going to take our direct material equivalent units, in our case 0, and we're going to multiply that by our cost per equivalent unit, the $5.72. Should come out as 0. Now we'll go ahead and get our costs for started and completed and ending work in process. So the same thing, we take our direct material equivalent unit and we multiply it by the cost per equivalent unit for direct materials. And then one more time, we are going to do this for our ending work in process. Direct materials equivalent units multiplied the cost per equivalent unit of direct material. This is going to give us a total of $366,080. No coincidence, this is going to be the same number of materials added. If it isn't, you have a problem somewhere in your problem. You need to go back and see where we made a mistake. In our case, we're okay, so let's keep moving forward. The process conversion runs the same way. The math that we use is we take our conversion equivalent units and we multiply it by our cost per equivalent unit of conversion. In our case, we've got 850 conversion equivalent units in beginning work in process multiplied by our $3. I'm just going to continue that process down for my started and completed, as well as my ending work in process, that 390 units multiplied by $3 a piece. And ultimately, that's going to give us a total amount of conversion cost added of $184,020. Again, that ties out to our conversion costs incurred for this period. We're going to come all the way to the right, and this is why I have it highlighted like this. We are just worried about the costs that have been assigned. So here we go. For our beginning work in process, $25,550. For our started and completed, $524,072. For our ending work in process, it's $23,478. And we are ultimately going to come down here and see what is the total amount of costs that we have allocated here. So I take out all of these allocated costs and I get $573,100. Now this chart will tick and tie both horizontally and vertically. If it doesn't, again, we've got some sort of problem here. Once again, in our case, we got it right. And that $573,100 ties out to our total costs to account for. Now we can figure out the last two parts of this problem. What we have in our finished goods inventory and what we have in our work in process inventory. Now again, visualize this manufacturing process. Anything that was already on our production line is going to be completed before any of the units that were started this month. So our finished goods inventory would consist both of our beginning work in process plus the units that were started and completed this period. So in our case, we have $549,622 that was transferred on to our finished goods inventory. That's going to leave us with, unsurprisingly, the units that are still in our work in process, $23,478. And that's how we would go ahead and solve this problem. So let's recap. We just worked on process costing, and this is used for products that are identical or substantially similar. Using that information, we used equivalent units to be able to determine the average cost per unit completed. Those costs of completed units are what we use to determine both our ending inventory and the units that were transferred on to finished goods inventory. So that's going to wrap up this video. I hope you all found this helpful, and we'll see you next time.